I would just have assumed to just step right up here, but I followed chance, so. Well, welcome, good morning. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to present for you our research. Dr. Bonner's already introduced ourselves and our title, so I'll pass on that. We all enjoy watching movies. We love going to the movies, experiencing movies, because we are all aware to one degree or another that films are conduits of stories, and these stories draw us in. They tell us about, or attempt to tell us about the nature of reality. They attempt to, in a way, connect the dots as to why things are the way that they are. And since this is the case, films are also carriers and conduits of worldview, which these worldviews also have philosophical and theological underpinnings which hold them up, which support them. And if we're to step back and take a look at these worldviews, at least the ones that we encountered, but in general, these worldviews affect how we view things like personhood, how we view things like teleology, the end toward which persons or human persons or other beings are aimed. These worldviews affect. They have an impact on how we engage with these kinds of questions. So any uncritical consumption or engagement with films in general, and not just these kinds of films, but just film in general, can lead us to adopt and espouse philosophies and theologies, worldviews that are insufficient and or incoherent. In terms of methodology, we viewed 10 films from the artificial intelligence genre within the larger population of film. In terms of interpreting that data, we took an ideological and a realist approach. The realist approach engaging questions of how these films presented and conveyed the nature of reality, and the ideological approach coming from the a Thomistic lens, that theological and philosophical heritage of thought associated with St. Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages. And in particular, with the ideological perspective, we're engaging these questions of personhood and teleology from, again, another particular perspective of the beatific vision, which essentially holds that God is the best, the ultimate and most fitting end or telos toward which persons and beings, all things, are aimed.
So of the 10 films we watched, we were able to discern 3 general notions of teleology within the films. The first of which we dubbed transhumanism proper. And the 3 films that fell under this category were 2001: A Space Odyssey, Chappie, and Transcendence. Transhumanism, for those of you who may not know, is this notion that the human destiny is meant to overcome their mortal, intellectual, and bodily limitations. We use the term proper because within these 3 films in particular, the protagonists within the films are the ones who are meant to transcend these limitations. What we found within the plots of these 3 films is that the body is typically depicted as a cage, a sort of tomb that the characters are born into and must transcend and escape. Death is an obstacle to be avoided, therefore. Additionally, the human destiny, if there did seem to be a telos within these 3 films, seemed to be something like perpetual progression. And so there did, in fact, seem to be a notion of telos within the film. And we see this exemplified within the quote here at the bottom of the screen by Will Castor from the film Transcendence, where he's kind of reveling in the strength and the potential that comes from transcending human limitations. When it comes from assessing these films from a Thomistic perspective, as I said before, they are to be commended in that they put forth a notion of telos. However, Aquinas would probably take issue with the fact that this notion of telos, this notion of human destiny, presented within these films is incoherent. That's because Aquinas would say that anything's end, anything's destiny has to be attainable. That's why we don't say that pigs are condemnable because they can't fly. It's not within the destiny of pigs to fly. It's not within their telos. However, insofar as these films present the notion of human destiny as a sort of infinite progression, perpetual progression, they put forth what philosophers call an infinite series of events, an infinite series of intermediaries between some sort of never-ending telos. Aquinas would take issue with this, however, in that it's impossible to traverse an infinite. This is easily demonstrable. If any of us began counting to infinity, or any of you began counting to infinity, not only would we go over time, but we wouldn't finish. And so, insofar as these three films have presented the human destiny as one that is must be captured within an infinite sort of progression, an infinite series of progression, they fail to be coherent. The films are to be commended in that they share a similar Thomistic notion of seeking more existence, a better state of existence. They see more knowledge and a greater state of existence as a worthy goal. However, Aquinas would say that these don't go far enough. Our goal isn't just to have more knowledge or more existence, but our goal is to behold truth in existence itself, which is to be found exclusively in God and is to be achieved only by means of the grace of God.
Now, another end which we interpreted these films as portraying was that of vicarious transhumanism. And what we mean by that is that rather than the emphasis of transcendence being placed upon the human agent, the emphasis of transcendence was placed more upon the AI or the robot. Additionally, within these films, there seemed to be presented that the goal of humanity was to create a successor, to create a new species of human that will take our place. So humanity right now fulfills a particular evolutionary niche, and then as these films presented the goal, we are to create a new species to take that spot. As the quote at the bottom of the screen suggests by Nathan from Ex Machina, we will be viewed as an upright ape inevitably facing extinction. However, if we are to engage these films with a Thomistic perspective, we find that some inconsistencies begin to arise, particularly with this idea of creating a new species of human being. Now, Thomas Aquinas says that human beings are composed of both rationality and animality. So if the vicarious transhumanist is going to advocate for a new species of human, they're going to have to provide us with a new definition of what it means to be human, essentially divorcing rationality from animality. But as difficult as David Oderberg suggests, to conceive of a being which is essentially material as possessing any kind of personal identity once it becomes just purely rational. Additionally, a kind of more pressing issue occurs. If we are to will the perfection of the AI, just perpetual perfection of the AI, we do so at the expense and neglect of willing our own perfection, something that a transhumanist and a Thomist would agree. There is something intrinsically worthy within ourselves of being perfected. So if we look at Thomas Aquinas' view of friendship, we can kind of see this idea take place. Thomas Aquinas says that in order for me to be a friend to you, I must first be a friend to myself. Or in other words, if I am to will your good, if I am to will your perfection, I cannot do so without willing first my own good or my own perfection. So if we adopt a vicarious transhumanist perspective, then we essentially neglect the intrinsic and inherent value that is within human beings.
The third view or perspective that was generally presented in the some of the remaining films, I, Robot, Age of Ultron, and Blade Runner, was this kind of ambivalent nihilism that it didn't focus so much on the body of persons having to transcend some kind of body, as it was focused on death and what did or didn't come after death. So the nihilism focused and saw death as the ultimate end, the ultimate telos for persons. The ambivalence comes right on its heels and says, well, since that's the case, we just might as well accept it. This is merely an inevitable fact of life, and it's something we just have to get over. So the emphasis is placed in this kind of carpe diem philosophy on the here and now, that the value for human life, the value, the beauty in life, the excitement in life is here, because we're not going to get anything afterward, so you might as well enjoy it. And this is perhaps epitomized by Gaff's ringing words at the end of the film Blade Runner, "It's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does?" Now, three conceivable objections, or at least responses to these this ambivalent nihilism, can conceivably be made in Christ's incarnation, in his suffering and his death, and in his resurrection. In the incarnation, in the person of Christ, divinity and humanity are joined inextricably. Those are so closely woven together that they can't be separated from one another. And this initiates the process of human salvation, which includes both image restoration and image perfection. In terms of, my apologies, in terms of his suffering and his death, a Thomist would hold that the suffering and death of Christ, during that process, he still enjoyed the beatific vision, that he still attained to God, that he still beheld God as God is. So the death and the suffering and the death of Christ imparts a certain kind of value on our own suffering and our own death as humans, since our humanity is joined with Christ, who is also divinity, going back to the incarnation. So the suffering in his death is something good. It's a good transformative event in the life of persons, and it's not something to be feared and avoided, nor is it something just to be accepted as merely inevitable, but is something to be embraced and welcomed as a transition point, as a good transition point on toward our end. In the resurrection, we find that there is actually something to hope for. That death isn't in fact the end, that Christ being raised from the dead provides for us the hope of an actualized potential to attain God, that we too, being joined with Christ, can behold God as he is in the end.
So of the 10 films we viewed, there was one notable exception that fell outside of our three notions of teleology, and this was the film Bicentennial Man. We say that this film is the most Thomist. That's not to say that the filmmakers set out to make some sort of cinematic Thomistic treatise, but it is most compatible with a Thomistic viewpoint. The reasons being is that the character Andrew, the protagonist within the film, he gains rationality towards the beginning of the film, and the film puts emphasis on the fact that he seeks having a body. It's essential to be human to not merely possess rationality, but to also possess animality. Additionally, the view of death within the film is something that makes us human. However, the death isn't viewed as something that bowls us over. It's not something that we just sort of accept and are kind of conquered by, nor is it something that we have to, an obstacle that we have to hurdle over. Within the film, death is, as within Thomism, a threshold to something more. In the last scene, as Andrew and his wife Portia are on their deathbeds, the last words of the film, Portia looks to Andrew and says, "I'll see you soon." So we have some notion of a real afterlife within this film. It's not the beatific vision per se, but it is something that's more compatible with a Thomistic perspective, that there is something after life, and we ought not to seek to perfect ourselves within this life. All in all, we found generally most of these films, 9 out of the 10, failed to present a philosophically coherent worldview. In particular, if we were to pinpoint the cause of this lack of robust philosophy, that comes from the lack of a real notion of teleology, a real notion of human end. So the notion of teleology within these films is at best insufficient, or at worst incoherent. The reason that this is important is because how we view persons, the destiny that we think people are bound towards, is going to affect every other aspect of life. It's going to affect how we treat others within our parishes, within our congregations. It's going to affect what sorts of public policies we attempt to pass. It's going to affect socially how we engage our neighbor in everyday activity. And so this whole endeavor that we've embarked on is to put an emphasis not on just theological and philosophical endeavors within everyday life, but it's to acknowledge that film presents theologies and it presents philosophies. And so this is an encouragement to Christians and all persons alike to engage film critically in order to discern good theology and philosophy.
Now, one of the strengths of this presentation and this project is that as far as we know, this is the first philosophical and theological engagement with the AI genre utilizing a Thomistic perspective. Now, we are not film students, we are not film theorists or film critics, so in opportunities to advance this project, we'd like to incorporate some of these disciplines. Maybe even students in English, in the English profession, who are studying and analyzing a narrative to kind of actualize the potential of interdisciplinary study that this project has. Additionally, the opportunities to be able to use different philosophical and theological perspectives and perhaps different film genres that analyze personhood altogether would be another opportunity if and when we pursue this project further. This is our bibliography. We'd like to acknowledge Dr. Stephen Bonner for helping us put the presentation together, Professor Micah Heatwell for providing many useful articles that were extremely helpful, and especially Dr. Mark Wiebe for being our faculty mentor, organizing the content, and providing many critiques of our presentation that proved useful.
In the very back.
Are the theologies presented in these movies an antithesis of the gospel?
Well, using the Thomistic perspective, we selected a tradition that represents a large breadth of the Christian tradition and the gospel as such. So, in regards to the gospel, the philosophies presented would be at odds with the gospel, would be at odds with the incarnation as Johnathan presented.
And just one more thought on that. I think most of the films, 9 out of 10 of them, are pretty crucially contrary to the message of the gospel. However, I think that it's not as if we're kind of being conspiracy theorists and think that Christians ought to avoid engaging these films. I think that we should engage these films because the film is an avenue that persons come about to attaining their own philosophies and theologies. So Christians should engage these films, one, because they're all pretty good, and two, they do express theologies and philosophies.
All right, so my question is, if a true, strong AI was to sit down across the table from Thomas Aquinas, what would Thomas Aquinas think of an actual strong, actualized AI, artificial intelligence, and how would he engage with one?
It strays a little bit from what we tried to achieve in our project, but I might say just a nugget on that. I think insofar as they're presented within the movies, there's a lot of leaps in reasoning within the movies where we're presented just a purely material notion of personhood as if there isn't some formal or spiritual aspect of persons. And so the movies don't really tell us much, but they do present persons as purely material. And so if that kind of AI sat across from Aquinas, he would say that it's not a person. It has some immaterial aspect to itself from which it derives its being, its soul, as Aquinas would say, the form of the body. So does that help?
Which of these movies best shows the theme of what does it mean to be human, and what movie genre do you think best goes about that theme, as opposed to the AI genre?
I think to the first question, I think that Bicentennial Man does the best job of expressing what it means to be human from a Christian perspective. The others may do a better job at exploring more secular or postmodern themes, but I think Bicentennial Man is more in accord with what we would consider Orthodox Christianity, the importance of the body. There's a quote I put at the bottom of the slide on Bicentennial Man that I failed to mention, was where Andrew says, "I would rather die a man than live forever as a machine." Even though it's within our capacity, especially now at the dawn of the 21st century, to perhaps achieve some sort of artificial immortality, Andrew has this notion that we should be we should be settled and content with our limitations, and we should accept these. And I think that's a very Christian idea.
As for the second part of your question, I don't know. I mean, that's where furthering this research can go as we engage other film genres and see, well, what kinds of views of personhood and teleology are they putting forward as commendable, as worthy of ascription. So that's definitely an opportunity. Great question.
Coming away from this experience, did you learn anything, or did your thinking change at all with respect to what it means to be human?
Thanks, Dr. Weeb. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, and no, yeah, but more yes. So coming in this film was kind of a rigid. We had some set things that we're just not willing to waver on, not willing to switch. But looking at more contemporary and especially Aquinas, the definitions used in defining what a human being is, and in particular David Oderberg, how he defines human and coming at a human person. I'm not settled one way or the other, but I am more open than I was at the beginning. So while I haven't necessarily sided on some of the issues at hand, I am open. I am willing to be more engaged than I was at the beginning. So I know that really doesn't answer the question directly, but I think that's where I'm at. Is it has opened my mind. It has opened my mind to different possibilities, and definitely the willingness to pursue this research further and maybe hopefully answer some of these questions that I have.
Okay, this is also a two-part question, but I was a big fan of the Star Wars Next Generation series, and you have Data who's always exploring how he really becomes human. So there's always a thing about getting a sense of humor and the joy of art and things like that. The second part of my question is kind of related to that. Did you purposely just pick these 10 films and then limit yourself to 10 films? And if so, were there some that were really hard to throw out that you could have used?
Yeah, we used the 10 films. These were the most more popular films, and just doing a quick search on Google for AI films, it's like these are some of the ones that come up the most primarily. But there were ones such as Matrix, The Matrix, and that's kind of at the end of the project, to look at different film genres. Because there are a lot of different film genres which incorporate AI that aren't specifically part of the AI genre. So yeah, and the first part of your question specifically with art, that's something that we found that was really interesting, is in these films which portrayed the AI as human, art was essential to these films. Art was I think almost in all of the films a constant sort of a predicate of personhood, of humanity. And so really interesting that you bring up art, because that's something that was really interesting in our research as well. So.
And not just art, but actually creating art. That they're actually drawing sketches or making paintings or what have you. And so there's not just sorry, I just went blank. There's not just a predicate for being able to recognize art, but to be able to create it. So that was certainly an interesting point of linkage between a lot of the movies, in that at least as they're portraying what it means to be human, that there's some kind of creative ability that needs to be present in an AI. At least that's how the film's presented. So.
One more?
Comment on the question. It seems like when we speak of art, it makes me think of Pleasantville. You have this, what it means to be human, and some have kind of denied for some time some expressions of personhood that eventually they're awakened to, right? Similar kinds of things go on in something like The Truman Show. And so sticking with that question about what it means to be human will open up lots of other great films that you could pull together in other categories. The other one is, another category would be dystopian science fiction that sees this as harmful, destructive. It's the Jurassic Park. You still thought about whether or not you could do it. You didn't stop thinking about whether or not you should. So some of these films may have had that, and that was the question part. were some of these AI films portrayed as a kind of a warning for, watch out what you ask for, you're not going to like it, or this is dangerous?
Certainly. Of the ones that I'm thinking of, 2001: A Space Odyssey, even Ex Machina to an extent. What were some other ones that you're thinking of? Avengers, certainly. Where there is this kind of warning is it's exploring what we haven't reached yet, to say what would happen if. So that's certainly present. Is that getting to the answer of your question?
I think as you explore further, take it back to the roots of science fiction and going beyond the bounds of man and even back to fallacies. It'll be great. Good luck.
Do you have more further questions for this group? Catch them before they drink. Did you want to comment on that? Or you guys want to go? All right, thank you very much.